ora. Hi there, church. Ki te pehe koe. How you going? My name's Odele Habets, and it's so good to be with you today, albeit remotely. I hope you're enjoying this summer weather. How are your neighbours? Do you get on well with your neighbours? Let's say John's your neighbour. Well, John's pretty selfish. He's a real grump, and he never helps anyone. He's a difficult person. He's angry and vindictive. And you're pretty sure that he killed your tree last year to get a better view. And whenever you have friends over for a barbecue, he opens up the window and turns his music up really loud. He leaves his rubbish bin out for days on end after the rubbish has been collected. He's got a dog that comes over and digs up your veggie garden and poops in it as well. The spouting of his house has come off, and so when it rains, the water comes off his roof directly onto your property. He's a great neighbour. Not. Well, John's gone on holiday and you notice that someone's trying to break into his house. So what do? A, you decide this is John getting what he deserves and you do nothing. B, you decide this must be the Lord punishing John and you decide it would be wrong to interfere. Or C, you decide it's wrong to watch while someone steals from John and you call the police. So what did you decide, or what would you decide? Maybe someone's harmed you or hurt you. Well, this morning we're going to be having a look at vengeance, justice, and mercy. And as a person who desires to follow God, is it okay to seek revenge, or is there another way? Why is vengeance often people's first impulse? Why do many of us want to get our own back? Our movies and social media are full of storylines of revenge. Do you remember that movie called Taken? I was going to share the clip, but I didn't want to scare our younger viewers. But you know the lines. He says, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. This is a phone, by the way. If you're looking for ransom, I can tell you I don't have money. But what I do have is a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you. If you let my daughter go now, that'll be the end of it. I will not look for you. I will not pursue you. But if you don't, I will look for you. I will find you. And I will ... You fill in the blanks. Well, you know what? The Bible also says a lot about revenge, justice, and mercy. And for purposes of today, we're going to be looking at 3 chapters, 1 Samuel 24, 25, and 26. We're first going to look at chapters 24 and 26 because they're both about Saul and David. And then we'll look at verse 25, which has been put between 24 and 26 for a reason. In chapter 24, we find Saul, along with 3,000 of his men, hunting David down. And Saul is worried that David's about to take his throne. So that's why he's out to kill him. And David and his men are hiding in a cave. Saul needs to go to the toilet and so decides to relieve himself in a cave. That so happens to be where David and his men are hiding. What are the chances of that? David could have easily killed Saul while he was dropping his drawers, for want of a better phrase. In fact, David's men encourages David to do so, using previous words of the Lord that had been spoken, when he said, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Well, certainly Saul had been given into David's hand in the most vulnerable state he could have been in. None of his soldiers were around. He was alone. He was focusing on other urgent matters and he had his trousers down. But what does David do? Instead of killing Saul, David sneaks up and cuts a bit of his robe off. Because David was faithful and he knew that the Lord had anointed Saul as king. And as so, because he was anointed, appointed, he was not to be touched. So after Saul leaves the cave, David follows out of the cave and he calls out, King, why do you hunt me down? Why do you listen to these people that I'm out to get you? I'm not. See, I could have killed you. He holds up the piece of cloth as he speaks. But I know you are God's anointed and I'm not to touch you. Saul then realizes it's David and realizes what could have just happened. And he breaks down in verse 16, "You're the one in the right, not me," he continued. "You've heaped good on me, and I've done evil on you, and now you've done it again, treated me generously. God put me into your hands, and you didn't kill me." Amazing. So David promises Saul that he wouldn't kill him, and Saul promises that he won't kill David. So Saul went home, and David and his men went up to the wilderness refuge. But then we return in chapter 26. We see that Saul is hunting David down again. He got it into his head that David was after him. So Saul wanted to make a preemptive strike on David to get before he got gotten. So 3,000 men again in search of David with the aim of killing him. So Saul sets up camp for the night, and Saul surrounds himself with soldiers, and he and his commander Abner were right in the centre. He had his commander right beside him, so he was protected in the best possible way. And David was nearby, and he planned to go into Saul's camp, and he asks, "Who will join me?" Abishai agrees. So that night, when all of Saul's soldiers, Saul and Abner, the commander of the army, when they were fast asleep, and God actually had put them into a deep sleep, David and Abishai tiptoe into the campsite, and they find Saul right in the centre. And at Saul's head was a spear and a water jug. And Abishai once again encourages the killing of Saul. He says, "This is the moment. God has put your enemy in your grasp. Let me nail him to the ground with his spear. One hit will do it. Believe me, I won't need a second." You see, Abishai also had a special skill set, just like Liam Neeson from Taken. But David said to Abishai, "Don't you dare hurt him. Who could lay a hand on God's anointed and even think of getting away with it?" What do? They grab the water jug and the spear that were laying at the head of Saul, and then they tiptoe back out of the camp. No one saw, no one knew, or no one woke up. And at daybreak, David went across to the opposite hill and stood far away on the top of the hill so that they were out of arm's reach. And then David shouts across to the army, Saul's army. He yells out, "Hey, Abner, how long do I have to wait for you to wake up and answer me?" It sounds rather mocking, probably mocking tone that was probably used. And Abner said, "Who's calling?" In verse 15 and 16. "Aren't you in charge there?" said David. "Why aren't you minding the store? You fell asleep on the job. Look what I have, the king's spear and the water jug that were right beside his head." By now Saul had recognized David's voice and said, "Is that you, my son David?" This is hilarious. David yelling across the terrain, waving Saul's spear and water jug, showing that he could have easily killed Saul if he had wanted to, but he hadn't. And then Saul recognizes David's voice and realizes what has happened. In verse 21, we read, Saul confessed, "I've sinned. Oh, come back, my dear son. I won't hurt you anymore. You've honoured me this day, treating my life as most precious, and I've acted a fool, a moral dunce, a real clown." One of Saul's servants then went across and retrieved the spear and presumably the water jug as well. I can imagine that would have been a really awkward moment going over to David. So here we have two occasions where Saul is out to kill David, and David could have easily put an end to Saul's life, easily taken revenge for being chased, but he chose mercy. And he exposed the truth that he wasn't out to get Saul. He lifted the cloth outside the cave in chapter 24. And he now in chapter 26, he lifts the spear and the water jug, displaying the truth, the evidence of how he didn't choose revenge for being hunted. But what if Saul wasn't God's anointed? Would have David done anything different? In other words, would have David taken revenge on someone if they weren't seen as God's anointed? Well, to answer that, let's look at chapter 25. Here we find David residing in the desert of Paran. Within the area that David and his men are watching over and protecting is a large property in Carmel, and it's owned by somebody called Nabal. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. He was rich. Nabal was not only wealthy, but he was mean, surly, and also known as a nasty idiot. In fact, his Hebrew name literally means fool. He clearly had really kind parents, calling their son Nabal, which means fool. I mean, what were they thinking? And unfortunately, he lived up to his name. No one liked to talk with him. His wife, however, was completely the opposite. She was beautiful, intelligent, and her name was Abigail. And we start this part of the story when it was sheep shearing time. It was a festive time, time to enjoy the harvest and time to celebrate. There would be wine, barbecue meat, freshly made bread. Oh, the mouth just waters thinking about it, much like many Aucklanders when they were coming out of level 4, thinking about level 3, so they could line up in ridiculous numbers outside KFC or other takeaway places. Anyway, because David and his men had guarded Nabal's land and animals, he figured that his men deserved a bit of the sheep shearing festivities. So he sent 10 of his men to be Uber drivers and to make a request for some goodies, some Uber Eats. That seems fair enough. So Nabal, being the fool that he was, how did he reply? What did he say? He said no, questioning why he should give to men from who knows where, just after he had been explained to him that David and his men had protected his land. So these 10 returned to David and gave Nabal's answer. So what was David's response? Strap on your swords, men. Time for your special skill sets to be used. 400 soldiers left to slaughter Nabal and his whole household. I would say that's somewhat vengeful, don't you think? Well, one of the servants that heard Nabal's response to David's men hurriedly went and told Abigail, Nabal, the fool's wife. Even the servants knew that this was going to end in disaster. So this rather stunning, intelligent woman then gives the following instructions. For 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 cooked sheep covered in herbs and spices, 5 seahs of roasted grain, which is about 45 litres, 100 raisin cakes, 200 fig cakes to be loaded onto donkeys. Abigail was hoping to meet David and stop him in his tracks to prevent the slaughter and destruction of her people. She came into a mountain ravine where David and his men were descending towards her. She jumps off her donkey, she bows down and she plants her face in the ground and asks for her to take the blame. And she asks for mercy. In verse 24 we read, "My master, let me take the blame. Let me speak to you. Listen to what I have to say. Don't dwell on that brute Nabal, on what Nabal did. He acts out of the meaning of his name, Nabal, fool. Foolishness oozes from him." Clearly not such a great relationship with her husband. She continues, "I wasn't there when the young men my servant sent arrived. I didn't see them. And now, my master, as God lives and as you live, God has kept you from this avenging murder. And may your enemies, all who seek my master's harm, end up like Nabal. Now take this gift that I, your servant girl, have brought to my master, and give it to your young men who follow in the steps of my master." So here we see she asks to take the blame. She goes on with eloquent words, asking for forgiveness, and then asking the Lord God to bring success to David. David then changes from seeking revenge to accepting the Uber Eats and lets Abigail go and promises not to avenge Nabal or his household. He thanks and he blesses Abigail. In verse 32 we read, "Praise be to God, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me today. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. Wow. So they go off now in different direction, different ways. David and his men away, happy with their cakes, meat, grain, and wine, and Abigail back to her foolish, very drunk husband. There's a bit of a twist to the story. About 10 days later, Nabal actually died, and Abigail ends up being one of David's wives. Thus ends the stories from 1 Samuel 24, 25, and 26. In chapters 24 and 26, we read that David could have taken Saul's life, but he didn't. He exposed the truth, showing he could have. He wanted to, but he didn't. Even though Saul was out to kill him, no revenge, but mercy. The Lord would be Saul's judge. When the Lord does it, it is justice. When people do it, it is revenge. And in chapters 25, so between these two chapters, we read about Abigail exposing the truth of her foolish, stupid husband and seeking mercy. David could have killed Nabal and his household. His men had their swords strapped to their sides, and they were on a mission to kill. And yet they stood and stopped in their tracks by this peacemaker. This person, this woman, Abigail, she stood in the gap between those who she loved and cared for, including her foolish husband, and the soldiers. She stood in the gap between them, between those that had offended her foolish husband and those who sought revenge. She stood in the gap. Here are the stories of revenge that could have taken place, but instead mercy is shown. And between the stories of Saul and David, going after David, and David leaving it to the Lord for justice, we find Abigail, this woman of wisdom. She appeals to the heart, to his honour that had been stomped on by her idiotic husband. And she also appeals to his stomach by hundreds of cakes and grain and wine and meat. David left it to the Lord for justice, and it actually so happened that Nabal died 10 days later. Justice by the Lord, not by David's hand. So when the Lord does it, it is justice. When people do it, it's revenge. Now, I'm not talking about law and order and the role of police, which is essential to the fabric of our society. Shout out to our New Zealand Police Force, which brings about justice within the limitations of the law. But rather, I'm talking about you and I and the challenges that we face when people harm or hurt us. When things are illegal, we have a system to bring law and order and hopefully justice. But we still have a choice to seek vengeance or show mercy and forgiveness. This picture of Abigail is one of grace. She is a peacemaker. Her words fall on David's ears like ice melts in the desert. Her meekness saves the day. Her manner, her humility, her dropping to his knees stops his anger, stopped his revenge. You know, Abigail's example points us to Jesus. She lived 1,000 years before Jesus, but we see the shadows of our servant king that is to come in her. Abigail placed herself between Nabal and David, and she offered to take the punishment. She gave an offering from their hard labor. And then we know that Jesus placed himself between us and God the Father. Jesus allowed him to take the punishment for you and for me. You know, we know Abigail shielded her family from David's anger, and Jesus shields us from the punishment that we deserve. So we thank the Lord for the Abigails in our world today that are peacemakers. And let you be like Abigail and become a peacemaker. Let us be peacemakers. May you ring the police for your neighbour John. As we start this new year, it is time to start afresh. This time of COVID and all its different variants has put us under stress. Some have lost jobs due to the no jab, no job mandate. Regardless of your viewpoint and understanding of these issues around the vaccine, let us, with God's help, be peacemakers. At other times, let us be like David and offer mercy, not seeking revenge, but leaving justice in the hands of the Lord. Take time to reflect and time to pray. A practical way of showing mercy to those that have harmed you or hurt you is to pray for them. And let us be thankful to our Jesus, our Saviour, who died for us and who stands in the gap for us today, who took the punishment and shows us grace and mercy. So the next time someone has wronged you, you could say, I don't know what you want. If you are looking for a ransom, I can tell you I don't have any money, but what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a long lifetime, skills that will confuse people like you. For I will look for you, I will find you, and I will desire to make peace, offer you grace, and grant you mercy. For that is my special skill set. Peacemaking, grace, and mercy, all through the power of the Holy Spirit. Bless you, church family. Go well.